Ok, bueno, bienvenidos a todos y todas. Soy Paul Gleeson y soy el Embajador de Irlanda aquí en Chile. Our two countries share an awful lot in common. We're both traditionally quite conservative or Catholic countries that through the years have become more modern, more progressive, more inclusive. And another thing we have in common is that we have both had constitutional conventions in quite recent times. In Ireland, we had a constitutional convention between 2012 and 2014, and that was followed then by two citizens' assemblies, the first between 2016 and 2018, and the second between 2019 and 2020. We're delighted now that we have one of Ireland's foremost experts on the work of the convention and our citizens' assemblies with us here in Chile now. And that's Jane Souter, who was a leading figure in both the convention and the assemblies, and who has worked internationally on this for years as an advisor to the Scottish Citizens' Assembly. And also Jane, of course, was the recipient of the Brown Democracy Medal in 2019. Her latest book is called Reimagining Democracy, Lessons in Deliberative Democracy from the Irish Frontline, and it's published by Cornell University Press. So Jane, we're thrilled you're here. We've been trying to get you here since before the pandemic, and it's terrific you finally made it. Maybe just for our viewers, you might start by saying a few words about how you came to be involved in the convention initially, because it was one of your initiatives, We the Citizens, that was kind of the precursor for that.
Yeah, so in 2011, myself and a group of other academics were looking at the possibility for deliberative democracy in Ireland, looking at the possibility of including citizens' voices in policy making. And we were making arguments that this would be a good idea because Ireland was going through a period of crisis after the Great Recession and trust in politicians was declining. But people were making arguments to us like, we already have a citizens' assembly, it's called the Irish Parliament, or you cannot possibly trust randomly selected citizens, what they propose will be madness, it won't work. So with the help of a philanthropist, Atlantic Philanthropies, Chuck Feeney, who was a great philanthropist in Ireland, we set up an organisation called We the Citizens, and there we brought together 100 randomly selected citizens. I think that's important, is that they were randomly selected, so they were just ordinary people from the street, some of whom might never have voted before. And we brought them together for a weekend and we got them to talk about different issues around political reform, around tax and spending. But the important thing that demonstrated was that these people were able to engage with ideas. They were able to make trade-offs. They might have their preferences, but they could see how they should change and, when they talk to other people. So we brought that report to the Irish government at the time, to the coalition that was in office. And I think they were quite encouraged by this. They could see that this was a way for them as politicians to engage with the people. And so they set up the first constitutional convention in Ireland. So I don't know whether you want me to talk about that convention.
I'd be interested to hear a bit, because that was a big departure for us, that constitutional convention. And it ended up producing recommendations which really, changed a lot in Ireland in terms of, domestic law in Ireland, but also how Ireland was perceived around the world.
Yeah, so one of the big issues at the time in Ireland, and a big issue between the two coalition parties, was marriage equality. So this was the main issue that they wanted in the convention, to have a look at it and see where the Irish people were on marriage equality. The main centre-right party at the time was very divided in itself. Its leader hadn't actually said where he was, and he was a little bit worried about it. But there were a range of other issues. So it started off with a couple of sort of easier issues, and then it looked at a range of others, and the central one being marriage equality. And it was quite extraordinary. We had 66 citizens and we had 33 politicians in there. So I think the politicians still, at that stage, they weren't completely sure that 100 citizens would be okay on their own. So we had 33 politicians and 66 citizens. And they sat at round tables as if they were at a wedding. You know, big tables in a hotel, and each table had a facilitator to make sure that the dialogue was respectful. And then experts and advocates and people from different places came and talked to them. So I remember one day, for example, we had a big long table of all the interest groups. So at one end of the table was Colin O'Gorman, the head of Amnesty International in Ireland, a very firm advocate of marriage equality. And at the other end of the table were the Knights of Columbanus, a very Catholic organisation. Sure, yeah. Who were not in favour of marriage equality. So all of the voices were heard and people talked about it. And then they had a vote about what they wanted to do. And in that vote, they voted overwhelmingly for that they were in favour of marriage equality and that they wanted the government to hold a referendum on marriage equality. And that was a very emotional day. There were a lot of tears, there were, you know, a lot of joy. People were delighted. This was something that people had been campaigning for a long time, because it had actually been illegal to be homosexual until quite late in Ireland because of our strong conservative tradition. So interestingly then, the government took it and they proposed the referendum, and the referendum was carried, and it was carried by a very similar margin to the margin in the convention. So it became clear then to the politicians that these randomly selected citizens were actually representative of the people. A lot of them had thought that no, when it came to a vote, people would think this was too radical, that the conservative tradition would not allow for it. But in fact, the randomly selected citizens have been very close to the overall one. So I think afterwards it was the photos from the celebrations of that went around the world, and you know, the world's media looked at us, and that became the point that people realised that Ireland was becoming more progressive, because we were the first country to actually vote for marriage equality by popular vote rather than by a vote in the Parliament.
I remember it. I was working in the South in America at the time, and you know, images of Ireland were of a very conservative, romanticised version of Ireland, and this was really jarring for people to get their heads around. But a terrific expression of the more open society Ireland had become, and it's always a journey, but a great landmark moment in that. Yeah. You know, minds, I suppose, are focused here in Chile very much on the work of the convention here at the moment, and when that work is completed, the path towards a referendum here as well. Are there lessons or experiences from Ireland that are interesting in the context of that journey from a convention completing its work up and until the referendum itself? I suppose communication as to the work that's been done by the convention is central.
Yeah, so I think that's the really important thing, is the communication between the convention or the mini public and then the general public. So we were lucky in Ireland that the public broadcaster had gone to the convention, had reported from it, had talked to the citizen and listened to them, and to the politicians and to the people on both sides. Initially, the media had been very sceptical about this, but as they sat and watched and as they listened, they became a little bit less sceptical. But it was actually the communications campaign then that I think was very important. So they'd learned lessons from the kind of dialogue in the convention. And some of the voices that had been that had really been listened to by the citizens were the voices of people who'd been affected. So the voices of the children of gay couples, the voices of couples who wanted to have children, but this was very difficult without marriage. And so the message then around it came about families and about empathy for your family and for friends who might be gay. So it became less a message about rights and people demanding rights, and more a message about family and community and kindness and caring and empathy. And that was something that I think really, you know, struck home for Irish people.
Sure.
You know, they had the students in Ireland ran a campaign called Phone Your Granny. So all of the students phoned their grandmothers and said, you know, this is important to me. I have friends who are gay. I want them to have this. We need to think about them. We need to be kind to them. And so it was these kind of messages that went around the country that I think became very important. Just thinking about how to treat our fellow citizens the way we would like to be treated.
Sure.
So I think that was the core of the communication. But it's that communication out to the wider public that is really key. Because otherwise, if you have a referendum, people can just vote on very much on emotion and very much on false narratives. You know, if we look at Brexit and so on, and we look at, you know, the kind of very difficult communication and information environment there.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned earlier on the shift then from a constitutional convention in Ireland to our citizens' assemblies, and what was different there, I suppose, was politicians were a part of the constitutional convention, but by the time we came to the citizens' assemblies, politicians weren't part of those assemblies. So could you tell us a little bit about why that shift was made and what impact you felt it had on the deliberations that were taking place?
Yeah, so I think that the next government that came in wanted to look at some more difficult issues, and they had a citizen assembly. So I think some of the politicians, or nearly all the politicians who've been in the first one, had learned to trust it. They could see that the citizens took it seriously, that they really listened to both sides, that they listened respectfully to each other, and that it was a good process. So they didn't feel the need so much to be in the room. And then I think the other part actually is that one of the main topics of the next one was abortion, which was a very, very difficult issue in Ireland for a very long time. And a lot of politicians had been on the receiving end of a lot of lobbying that was quite difficult for them. It was very emotional. So I think they trusted the process, and then to be outside of it was also better for them. But interestingly, what they did after the Assembly reported, they set up a special parliamentary committee to debate it. So they looked at all the issues, they called many of the same witnesses again themselves, and they really thought about it themselves. And in fact, in that, we had quite a lot of our centre-right politicians who said that they themselves had never really thought about why, for example, they'd been anti-abortion. They were just instinctively there. They'd been born into a family that was like that. It was the culture. But in fact, when they heard the kind of evidence that the Citizen Assembly heard, when they thought about the lived experience of some of the people who required abortion on different grounds, then they changed their minds. So that was also quite powerful, I think.
Yeah.
And likewise on climate change, which was the second big topic of that Citizen Assembly, Ireland had always been quite a climate change laggard. Very difficult for us to meet our targets in Paris and so on. A very strong agricultural lobby and so on. But again, after the politicians had a special parliamentary committee about that, they actually voted, one of the first countries in the world to vote to declare a climate emergency. So again, it was quite powerful and a different way for politicians to engage. I think one of the really interesting things, and some of the ministers who were involved, you know, some of the people involved went on to be quite senior ministers, you know, ministers for justice and so on. And what they said to me is that before, when they'd engaged with citizens, it had always been because the citizens wanted something.
Yeah.
You know, they needed some investment, or their road fixed, or the school, or it was always about demands. And this was the first time they'd actually talked to citizens about actual policy. Usually they were only used to hearing from NGOs or vested interests or business or unions, or, you know, but they hadn't actually listened to randomly selected citizens as an interest group before.
So it provided that kind of opportunity to step back from the day-to-day or the clientelist approach and to consider it in the round. with very interesting, as you say, outcomes. I mean, just moving away from Ireland for a minute, because I mean, your research on deliberative democracy scans the world. I mean, you've done a huge amount of work in this area. Are there other examples or lessons globally that you think would be of interest here in Chile with all the considerations going on at the moment and all the Constitutional Convention work?
Yeah, well, the world is kind of looking at Chile now, and it's such an interesting experiment. And, you know, there's no right way or wrong way to do these things. You know, it's very much a new field.
Yeah.
It depends on the political culture in the different countries and so on. But, you know, there's interesting things. So, for example, in Ostbelgien, which is the German-speaking part of East Belgium, they replaced their second chamber with a chamber for randomly selected citizens. So they don't become like politicians because they're just selected randomly. They don't run for election or whatever, and they change every 2 years. So they're just there for a short period of time. And they look at a couple of issues every year. There's another, in the main Belgian parliament, there's something similar going on. In Paris, it's really interesting. So the city of Paris has set up a new citizen deliberation forum which will work with all of the different arrondissements around Paris, and will look at the issues of interest to the citizens of Paris. And again, randomly selected citizens go in for a short period of time. Scotland has had a really interesting process looking at climate change, because Scotland is one of the parts of the UK that will be, you know, really affected, and it has the oil fields and so on. And they really called for quite radical measures to tackle climate change, and they had very good engagement with the Parliament in Scotland. And then, interestingly, we're just coming to the end of a process in Europe now, where the European Commission has run a process called the Conference on the Future of Europe. And that's people from all 23 countries with all those different languages, all looking at different issues and about how we as Europeans want to be able to respond to them. And none of these processes are perfect, you know. So, and all of them are learning from each other, and all of them are iterative. But yeah, the Chile experiment is very much part of this, and there will be lessons for us from Chile, I'm sure, and hopefully lessons from some of the things happening in Europe for Chileans as well.
Absolutely. I mean, from the outset here, you know, they've created a convention that has full gender equality in its makeup, really strong representation of Indigenous voices. So it is a great illustration of some of the ways this can be done here. And I mean, I think even from a gender equality perspective, because I know that's a key issue as well with conventions and assemblies as well. Another issue is about, you know, makeup, as you say, and whether citizens are selected randomly, as was the case in Ireland's citizens' assemblies, or whether they're voted in to be a part of it. I mean, I suppose they create different dynamics depending on the method that's chosen.
Yeah, so some of the first ones in Canada, they were voted in as well. So that's sort of the Chilean model. The difference is, I think, that if people are voted in, they're likely in the beginning to have been people who are active in their community. People who have an issue and who, you know, want to put it forward and run for election. So that has pros, you know, because the people are really interested, and it has cons that maybe they're not as like the rest of the population because they're really involved. So the advantage of the randomly selected citizens is that it could be my grandmother who has no real interest in politics who is sitting there. It could be somebody who has never voted before. But then, of course, she will have less knowledge, and so there has to be a lot of knowledge gaining and a lot of evidence that goes on then to bring people up so as they feel comfortable talking about the issues. But it's really interesting with the Indigenous voices, because in Ireland, in our first ones, We selected people based on 50-50 gender, so similar to Chile, and from the different regions, and from different socioeconomic groups, so unemployed people up to professional people. But we didn't actually have anything for different ethnic groups, for example. And in the most recent one, where we're just starting the recruitment now, Art O'Leary, who I know you had talking to people, is running that. And he's just sent out 35,000 letters to people throughout Ireland. And, you know, he wants to have travelling people there and people of different ethnicities there now as well. So that's something we've learned from Chile.
It's great,
which is really interesting.
Have the lesson learning in all directions. Well, it's a perfect note to leave it at. Jane, just to say thank you for your visit, for your engagement with the convention this week and with the embassy, and just to say thank you as well to our followers for following us and for engaging with this discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you.